My name is Charles Harrell, and I work for the Veterans History Project. Today is February 21st, 2005. I'm here interviewing a veteran of World War II, Mr. Carlton Earl. And also attending this interview is Miss Ashley Eller. I met Mr. Earl through Miss Ashley Eller, a student of mine. For the record, Mr. Earl, would you state your full name?
Carlton Ward Earl.
And what is your birth date?
Birth date is February 3rd, 1923.
And what is your current address?
Current address is 309 Laurel Avenue, Fredericksburg, Virginia.
What war did you serve in, sir?
Served in World War II.
And what branch of service?
Served in the 14th Armored Division, 154th Signal Company.
And can you tell me where you served?
Served basic training here at Fort Knox, Kentucky, and joined the 14th Armored for further training at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Then overseas from there.
Mr. Earl, would you try to think back to your earliest memories back in the late 20s, early 30s? Can you remember anything from that time period?
Well, yes, I remember where we lived and so forth. We lived in my grandmother's home as my earliest memories.
Where were you born?
I was born in Northumberland County, Virginia, down in the northern neck. I lived in my grandmother's home, which was midway between Kilmarnock and Whitestone, Virginia.
Can you describe your grandmother?
Yes, my grandmother was let's see, I guess you would say she was somewhat on the heavy side, very short and stout, and a very, very sweet lady.
What was her name?
Her name was Leuna, Leuna, very odd name.
Would that be Earl?
That would be Earl.
How about your granddaddy? Where was he?
My grandfather died when my father was just a teenager. They had three sons. They had an older son, Carlton, who I was named after, a middle son, Harry, and my father, John. And Carlton and my grandfather died within a year of each other, both, I think, of scarlet fever.
Was that before you were born then?
That was like I say, my father was only 12, 13 years old, something like that.
What do you remember about your grandmother?
Oh, I just remember what a wonderful lady she was. I spent a lot of time with her because she lived with us most of my life. She had that place there near Kilmarnock, but she stayed there in the summer, and I'd go and spend the summers with her usually when I was young. And so we were very close.
Can you tell me about your father?
Well, yes, my father was a carpenter, and we moved around a lot. We lived in Pennsylvania, we lived in Maryland, we lived in Virginia, following his work. Then when the Great Depression started, carpenter work sort of fell off, and I had an uncle who lived in Washington, D.C., who worked for what was then the sanitary grocery chain, which is now Safeway, and he got my father a job in the stores in D.C., and he worked at that pretty much through most of the Depression.
Was he just a grocery clerk?
He was at first a grocery clerk, and then at one point he was a manager of a store.
In Washington?
In Washington.
Where did you all live?
During that time, early on we lived at my grandmother's place down in Virginia, and then later on we moved to D.C. and rented. Then after things sort of calmed down after the Depression, my father and his brother and another fellow formed a building business. And at that time we were living in Cottage City, Maryland.
Can you tell me about your mother?
My mother was also a very sweet lady, and we also were very close. And I have one sister who is 10 years younger than I am, and she lives down near Kilmarnock still.
So when she was born, Great Depression was in its full swing.
Pretty much so, yes.
Did you make any childhood friends?
Oh yes, I had childhood friends, none that have survived, I think, to this point. Made friends as a teenager in high school and that sort of things, who some still survive as well as I do.
Who was your best friend before you got to high school that you can remember, and what did you do together?
It's a good question. I don't know if I can answer that. My grandmother had part of her home, it was a big house, and she had rented part of it out to another family, and they had children or grandchildren that I played with during the summers. But I don't know if any of those are still alive or not. I've sort of lost track of them.
When you got into, did you graduate high school?
Yes, sir.
When you got into high school, did you make any close bonds?
Oh, yes. I had quite a few close bonds. I had one friend named Franklin Hogawat, who has since passed away, but we were very, very close. We palled around together all the time. And another one named Frank Hall. Then there were several girls that we went to school with that we were all friends with. One, Marguerite. Can't think of her last name now. Her last name now is Lurch, but I can't think of what it was at that time. Voigt, V-O-I-G-T. And Esther Burton, and Irene, can't think of her last name now either. 3 girls are still alive, and we still correspond, still talk, and I have visited with them at one time or another.
Can you tell me of any incidences that you went and did something with your friends?
Oh yes, I started learning to play the steel guitar when I was 10 years old, and when we got to high school, the same bunch that I just mentioned got together and formed a little orchestra, and we practiced and we played together, and don't know who he was, but some older fellow got a hold of us, found us, and he used to take us as an orchestra. He took us around to hospitals, nursing homes, and that sort of thing, and we played a little program for them. So,
While you were in high school?
While I was in high school, right. Then after high school, I got to play what I call semi-professionally because I got paid for it, but I wasn't really a professional musician, but I played in several dance bands for, I guess, 30 years.
Did your buddies from high school continue to play with you?
The one did, Franklin Hogawat, continued to play until the war came along, World War II, and he went to work in a defense plant over in Baltimore, and he'd come back once in a while on weekends and play, but he went into that business earlier than I went in the service, and he went in the service before I did.
Can you recall any type of doing without things during the Great Depression?
No, not really. We didn't really know we were poor, I guess. I mean, we had plenty to eat. My father always worked enough that we had plenty to eat. I had clothes. We went to school, and I had a bicycle when I needed it, and things like that. So I don't really remember having to do without very much.
Did you ever get an allowance?
No, I didn't. I started working pretty young when I was still. Well, I wasn't in grade school, but when I first started in high school, I got a paper route, started working paper routes, and don't remember what I did right offhand after that, but I always made money.
Where was your paper route?
It was in Maryland.
Near suburban Washington somewhere?
Yes. Yeah, we lived in suburban Washington.
Was there any time when your parents finally settled down into one house?
Yes, that was after he started the building business. He bought a house from the people that they were building for, the man that he was building for, and unfortunately, there were a few times when things weren't great. Coco, what are you doing? When things weren't great, and I think he missed a payment on the house. The guy foreclosed and took it away.
After one payment?
I think it was just one payment. So, but then after that, he did buy another house in suburban Maryland, and we lived there I was married there. Going to get rid of that.
No, she'll take care of it.
Okay.
You get this cat. When were you married?
I was married, I was in the service. We were married in 1944.
So you were in the service. I didn't want to go that far yet. Tell me, did you know as a high school student in the late 30s, did you know what was happening in the world, and did you recognize war coming?
Not really until the early 40s, I think. When after we had actually, well, I knew things were going on, but I guess what really made it happen, I can remember exactly where I was when Pearl Harbor came.
Where were you?
Or at least when we got the announcement, we had been visiting down near Kilmarnock, and we were driving back. I had a radio in the car, and just as we came through Februgary, I was crossing the Falmouth Bridge when the announcement came over the radio that Pearl Harbor had been attacked.
Was it on December 7th?
It was on December 7th.
You recall what time of day you heard that?
It was afternoon.
Were you driving the car at the time?
Yes, it was my car.
And your dad and mother, where were they at the time?
They weren't with me. I don't remember who was with me.
What was your feeling? What did you say?
Gosh, I don't know what in the world. How could this happen? You know, and how awful that was.
You were around when we were attacked in 2001.
Yes.
Was the feeling similar?
Sort of similar, yes. I mean, it's the sort of thing you just don't expect things like that to happen. And, I guess the feeling was pretty much the same.
Did you just drive on home?
That day, yes.
How long was it before you were deciding to join the service?
Well, I didn't join. I had been thinking about it. Of course, I was still a teenager. I was drafted before I was 21.
You were graduated by the time Pearl Harbor came.
Oh, yes. Yes, I had graduated from high school by then.
What was your job by that time?
I was working as an apprentice bookbinder in a printing plant in D.C.
Was it just a job, or were you hoping to become some type of printer?
No, it was. It wasn't just a job. I was hoping to become a bookbinder, which I did eventually. I had been working after I got out of high school, working in a grocery store as a clerk and truck driver. Back in those days, I worked in what they called a DGS, district grocery stores, and they always delivered groceries. People would call up in the morning and give their what they wanted that day, and along about 10 or 11 o'clock, I would load the truck up and deliver those groceries, and then I clerked in the store the rest of the day. But they were long hours back then, and for not very much money. And so my uncle worked in this printing plant. It was called National Capital Press in D.C. And he told me that they were looking for some help, just plain help in the bindery. And so I went down and applied for the job and got it. And I worked as a helper, I guess, for maybe 6 months. And the boss came and said, if you'd like to be an apprentice, we'll give you an apprenticeship. And the apprenticeship was 4 years to become this was a union shop, of course. And, apprenticeship was 4 years. And I guess because of the war, I went into the service before my 4 years was up, and it was right after I came back. I think they gave me my journeyman's card. So I actually only served as an apprentice 2.5 years. I got my card, full journeyman's card after the 2.5 years when I came back out of the service.
So you were working for about 2.5 years before you went into the service?
Yes.
On the day that you received your draft notice, what did you do?
I guess I was happy in a way. Most of my friends had gone, and I thought, I don't really want to go, but at the same time I do want to go. And so when the draft came along, I was glad of it.
Had you gotten any letters from your friends?
Probably. I don't remember offhand, but probably had.
So where did you have to go?
Went to an induction camp in Maryland, and I can't think of the name of it, right near Rockville, Maryland. And stayed there a couple of weeks, I guess.
How did it feel that first day you were in an induction camp?
Confusing. Because, I didn't know what to expect, didn't know what was happening really. And of course everybody wanted to know, we knew we wouldn't stay there, and wondering where we'd go. We went through a lot of testing to see what we were capable of, what we should be most qualified to do, and that sort of thing. And since I was a musician, Morse code has a definite beat to it. Musicians make good operators, usually. And so the testing showed that I would make a good operator, and that's how I happened to be sent to Fort Knox. That was the radio school at Fort Knox.
But you had no clue you were going to the 14th Armored at that time?
No, not at that point. We didn't know until after basic, and then radio school was over.
Can you tell me how you felt at basic training?
Upbeat, I would say. I mean, I'm learning new things, and things are going pretty well. And,
were you physically fit?
I was by the time I got through basic. I wasn't too really physically fit. At that time I had always been pretty thin, but I wasn't really too far out of shape because working in binder, you work pretty hard. For instance, I worked on what's called a folding machine. It was a fairly large machine, and the paper that you put onto the machine was 38 by 50 inches. And you'd roll up a lift of that about half, 3/4 of an inch thick. By that time, that weighs pretty much. By the time you get it rolled up and on your shoulder, and you walk up 4 steps with that on your shoulder and lay it down on the top of the machine and spread it out, and then you're coming down and take the finished product off the other end. So I guess I was probably pretty well physically fit, because that goes on for 8 hours, and every few minutes you're loading another load on top.
Can you tell me your biggest challenge you had in basic training?
Good question. I don't know. I hate to tell you, I can't answer a question.
You were able to do most everything.
I was able to do just about everything that was required, yes.
Was there anybody you got close with during that 8 weeks?
I don't believe so. Well, yes, there was one fellow too, a fellow musician, and he was from California. He played trumpet, and he finally got transferred to the local band. But we became pretty close and kept up until just a few years ago, and I didn't hear from him. I assume he must be dead by now, but I lost track of him.
Had you thought about joining the band in the Army also?
No, I wasn't that kind of a musician. My instrument is not one that would work in a band or a big orchestra even. And so, no, I didn't give that any thought at all.
When you tested to go into the signal company and you traveled out to Fort Knox to get your training, did you think, or did you have any dreams that maybe this is something you want to explore further?
You mean the Army in general? Or?
No, working with Morse code and
Oh.
signaling.
Well, no, not right at that time. In fact, I'm not sure if they even told me at the time of the testing what I would be. Well, I think they did say something about that. But, of course, basic training at Fort Knox had nothing to do with radio. When you got through with the basic training, that may have been where we did the testing. Might have been. And then they said, well, we're going to send you on to radio school, which was still there on Fort Knox, and that was another 17 weeks.
Was there anything that in your early days of boot camp that you saw happen that you thought was just the funniest thing you had ever seen?
No, I don't remember anything funny. I remember a sad thing. One of the fellows, I didn't know him real well, but he was in the same unit, and in one of the training exercises where they had the things like kids play on, the big bars, where you climb up and so forth, and he fell off and got killed, and so that was pretty bad.
Broke his neck or something like that?
I don't remember. I didn't see it happen. Just heard about it afterwards.
How was the food?
Food wasn't bad at all. I didn't have any problem with the food, really.
You better or worse than what you were getting home?
Oh, it wasn't like home cooking, but it was, it was good. It tasted good, and it was nourishing, so it was all right.
As you went into that specialized school for radio,
Mm-hmm.
Where was that being held?
That was there at Fort Knox also.
Fort Knox. What type of challenges did you face there?
I guess the challenge of learning the code, really, because it had to be done pretty fast. In 17 weeks, you had to really do a lot of learning, not only about the code, but about not really repairing radios or anything like that, but you had to learn the types of radios that we had in the Armored Force and how to use them and that kind of thing.
So you thought that maybe you'd go into the Armored Force at that time?
Yes. Well, of course, Fort Knox was an Armored Force base. So by that time we knew we were going to be in some kind of Armored Force.
Did they give you some type of graduation certificate?
Not that I suppose they did, but don't remember.
And when you left Fort Knox to head to Fort Campbell, you had no clue that you were going there?
We didn't know where we were going, no. We just knew we were going.
Have you ever been that far away from home?
Before? No.
By this time, and you're heading toward Fort Campbell, or Camp Campbell, had you made a close friend that you hung with?
Yes, a Leroy DeRava from Chicago. And like I say, he passed away a few years ago. But we kept pretty much in touch ever since then. And we went overseas together in the same outfit. And we're in the same, I think we were in the same radio crew. Pretty much all the way through.
Were you a big drinker, a big smoker at the time?
No, I had started smoking a pipe a little bit before I went to the service, and that was so much trouble finding a place to keep your tobacco and matches and pipe that I got started smoking cigarettes then. And I smoked, that would have been in 1943. And I smoked until about 1946, I guess. And then I quit entirely. Haven't smoked since.
Well, that's remarkable. Especially how much they gave you cigarettes.
Oh yeah, we had free cigarettes, and by the time I quit, I was getting pretty close to 2 packs a day. And, I had the standard smoker's cough and the whole bit. Decided it was time to quit.
Did you see any shows during that time here in the States? USO shows, dances?
Yes, I remember seeing a few. I don't remember now which they were. I remember seeing Bob Hope overseas.
But here in the States, you
and
didn't.
some lesser ones.
Were you a big dancer, socialite?
No. By playing music, I never had time to learn to dance, and I just never did. Oh, a little, senior prom and that kind of thing, but I never was really a dancer.
Did you have any special girlfriends at this time before you went into service?
Yeah, I had a girlfriend. We went together quite some time, and then before I went into service, she married one of my friends, and we had broken up anyway before that, and she married one of my friends, and then I started going with Liz before I went into service. I had been going with her for a couple of years before.
Where did you meet her?
At one of the dances, the old folks, there was an older man and his wife that ran the band that I was playing with, and we played in Virginia, up in Fairfax County, up that way. And he lived across the street from Elizabeth's parents and they used to bring her to the dance, and that's where I met her.
So when you went off to the service, were you writing, Liz?
Oh, yes. Writing quite often. We had already not made it formal, but we knew we were going to get married eventually.
Did your parents approve of her?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
You were writing home to your parents also?
Oh, yeah.
How often, some people are writers and some were not. Would you consider your parents to be writers?
No, probably once a week or so, something like that.
But you wrote a lot more?
No, about the same, I guess. I never was a really great writer either.
And then you got to Camp Campbell.
Got to Camp Campbell.
What was your first impression?
It's kind of a barren place. Just dirt and barracks. It wasn't nearly as pretty. Fort Knox was a pretty place, really, but it wasn't really that pretty there at Campbell.
Had you learned how to take apart radios by this time?
Well, we didn't really actually work on them to take them apart or anything, just how to operate, really. In the school, we learned to operate and that kind of thing. And then there was an entirely different school for those who were technicians and who worked on the radios.
By this time, had you been promoted?
No, I was still private at that time, I think. I think I made PFC probably not too long after I got to Campbell.
How long did you stay at Fort Campbell?
Let's see. I got there, I went in March, so I got there in the fall. I had basic training and then the 17 weeks of radio school and then to Fort Campbell. So I was at Campbell a year and a half, 2 years, I guess, total.
And while you were there, what were you doing?
Further study as to how the division would actually work in combat and that sort of thing. We did maneuvers and we did practice things.
What was your primary job there during that year?
As a radio operator. That was my primary job.
Can you describe what you did?
Well, let's see. Yes, the radios were mounted in half tracks, and your half track would be deployed to either to division headquarters, or it would be deployed to one of the tank battalions or an engineering battalion or something of that kind, and you would then communicate back and forth with headquarters. My crew was, I wasn't the crew chief, but the crew I was in were primarily with headquarters, pretty much all the way through the war, division headquarters.
So you were based in a headquarters where the captain, or would it be more of a general?
Where the general's headquarters was, generally, mainly.
When you got a note over the radio, did it come by voice or by clicks?
No, it came by code, Morse code. We used voice very, very seldom. Most always since everything had to be coded anyway, secret coded. and that was the simplest way to do it, by Morse code.
Now, were you actually listening, or were you writing down, or were you delivering? What was your specific job?
Well, you would listen, and as the message came through, you wrote it. We had special pads that were designed to copy the messages on, and you would copy the message and then turn it over to the crew chief, and he would pass it on to a courier, who would take it on to whoever it was addressed to.
Was parts of your company distributed throughout the entire division?
Oh, yes. Yes, we had radio people at all of the battalion headquarters and that kind of thing. See, an armored division is made up of tank battalions, engineer battalions, infantry battalions, and so there was several places for radio operators to go.
And were these radio operators all part of your company?
They would be part of the company, and they would be assigned to these various battalions.
Did you become familiar with the other crews that were attached to the other battalions?
Yeah, pretty much we knew everybody in the company, because they maybe, well, particularly during training, they might be just assigned during the day and come back to our company at night.
When you went into combat areas, did you see each other that often anymore?
No, not so often once we got into combat, no.
There in Camp Campbell, were you ever anxious to get into combat and go overseas?
Well, I don't say I was really anxious, but I wasn't apprehensive about it. I mean, I was ready to go, but I wasn't chomping at the bit.
Were you concerned about having to actually kill people?
Not so much, because that wasn't my job.
And you knew it wasn't going
I
to be
knew
your
it
job?
wasn't going to be my job. I carried, we didn't even carry, the radio operators didn't carry an M1 rifle like infantry carry. We carried carbines. So it was more or less a matter of using the rifle as a matter of defense if you had to. But we weren't actually, our job wasn't to go out and kill the enemy.
Did you do any close order drill?
Oh yeah, plenty of that.
So you knew how to do that?
Oh yes. And that's a necessary thing, because it gives you discipline.
How much combat drill did you do, such as an infantryman would do?
Not a great deal of that. Some, but not very much, because of what our job was.
Did you have practices of setting up your radios?
Oh yeah.
Was there a time limit on how long it took?
No, I don't think so. I don't remember there being. Well, in fact, the radio was pretty much always set up in the half track and ready to go at any time. So it was just a matter of starting the engine so that we had power for the radio, and that was it.
So the power for the radio came from the engine of the truck?
Partly, yes. That wasn't, of course, nearly enough, but the radios had a generator built into them. And I guess the generator was powered by the battery, and it created more current than you could get just from the half-track battery.
After your year in Campbell, can you recall when you got your orders to head out?
Yeah, we left in August of
44?
44, I guess.
That would be the invasion of southern France.
The invasion of southern France was over by the time we got there.
Right.
Now, I remember one funny story from training,
Okay, please.
if you're interested. We were out on training in the half-track, and we were out in the mountains. Camp Cal was in mountainous territory. And we were riding around out in the mountains and trying to find where we were supposed to go. And a radio crew consisted of a crew chief and 3 operators and a driver. The driver had nothing to do with radio at all. He just drove the half track. So we came around a little turn up on top of this hill. There was a bunch of young kids, maybe 8, 10 years old, barefoot, playing out in the yard, you know. And one of the guys stood up and said, "Hey, how far is it to Louisville?" The little girl pipes up, she said, "I don't rightly know, but it's a pretty fair piece." So we thought that was kind of funny.
Can you tell me where you left the United States from?
From New York.
And what was the name of the boat?
I think I was on the Santa Paula. There were twin ships, Santa Paula and the Santa Rosa, and I believe I was on the Paula. Had been converted to a troop ship, and like I said, it was carrying about 6,000 of us.
How was the trip across the sea?
It was calm and smooth, and like I say, we were in a convoy, plenty of other ships around us, and every once in a while we'd see one of the destroyers take off and circle us and that sort of thing, like that probably was a submarine somewhere. But nobody in the convoy ever got hit that I know of.
Did you have any rough weather at all?
Not until we got into the Mediterranean.
So you went directly to the Med, didn't go through England?
No, we went down by the Canary Islands and up that way, going over and into the Mediterranean.
How did it feel when you got into your first rough weather?
I don't remember getting seasick myself. The only time I got sick was while we were still in New York Harbor. We got in there and they fed us some hot dogs that were spoiled and everybody on board got sick. But that's the only time I remember getting sick going over or coming back. Coming back was a lot of rough weather coming back home after the war, but going over I don't remember really getting sick. I got a little queasy perhaps, but
can you tell me about trying to sleep aboard a ship?
it was a little bit rough. The bunks were stacked 3 or 4 high. And you had just barely enough space to crawl in. You couldn't sit up once you got in the bunk and that kind of thing. And but it wasn't bad.
Did you have an assigned bunk?
Yes, you were assigned a particular bunk, and you had all of your gear was with you, and you carried it stacked up on the bunk along with you, the big duffel bag.
What would be in your gear?
All of your clothing and everything that you owned.
No weapon?
No weapon. No, we didn't have weapons with us. I don't remember having a weapon with us. We got those after we got overseas.
Where did you land when you first landed?
What's the name of the city in southern
Marseille?
France? Marseille.
Marseille.
Right, that's where we landed.
And can you describe how you landed?
I don't remember if we landed day or night, but I know we stayed there in the harbor for a number of hours before we disembarked, and they had trucks waiting for us to take us to where we were going to stay. My company stayed in a hotel, what had been a hotel there in Marseille.
And did you stay as a company at that time?
I believe we did, yes. Or at least the radio section stayed as a unit.
When you landed, was it on a beach or was it more of on a dock?
On the dock.
And there at Marseille, you said that it used to be a hotel. Can you describe any of the battle damage you had seen there?
There was quite a bit of battle damage. The hotel wasn't in very good shape. It was operable, and toilets worked and things like that, but it wasn't in really very good shape.
At this time, you were still behind the lines, correct?
Oh, yes.
Did you see any civilians?
Oh, yeah, a lot of civilians. What happened was, as I told you earlier, all of our equipment went to Belgium or somewhere out there, and we landed in Marseille, and rather than get our brand new equipment shipped down to us, they gave us equipment that had been through the Egyptian campaign, or the African campaign, I guess it was. And we had to practically rebuild everything. It didn't have any equipment. We had to get radios and mount them, and we spent 2 or 3 weeks getting the radios and half tracks ready.
Were they the same style of radios?
Yes, yeah, they were the same.
Just
same
used.
types, just used. And of course, the vehicles were all used, well used.
Did you, as your division advanced through southern France, did you see any dead people?
Oh yes, you'd see dead people from time to time, dead horses, of course, because the Germans were still using a lot of horses, and of course the French were using a lot of horses, and so you'd see a lot of dead animals and a few dead people.
How about, how many people were on your crew that operated your radio?
There were 4 of us plus a driver, 5 of us in that particular crew.
And you would ride in the half track?
Yeah, we rode in the half track.
And where did you get your meals?
K rations mostly when we were traveling, and once we got set up somewhere, if there was a place to eat, we could. Otherwise, our driver was pretty good at commandeering things, and he'd get cans of Spam and canned vegetables and stuff, and we'd build a little fire somewhere and do our own cooking.
As you were heading from Marseille up toward Alsace and Lorraine, did you, how long do you think it took you from the time you left Marseille until you got to the German border?
Oh, that was several months.
Did you ever come under enemy attack?
Not a direct attack. We mainly, by being with headquarters, mainly all we had to worry with was aircraft strafing and artillery fire. And we'd have that from time to time. Especially when you were in Chowline, that's when the strafing usually came around. So you'd hear the planes coming and you'd hit the ground. But I don't remember never hitting anybody.
How close did it ever come to you?
I don't remember ever seeing any of the bullets hit the ground, so it must not have been too close.
But you could see the airplane?
We could see and hear the airplane, yeah, and hear the firing.
How about when the artillery came in?
Well, you could hear that too. And I never had it come close enough really to do me any damage. Now, we did have some from time to time in other parts of the company. The wire people were the most vulnerable. The people that did the wire division, people strung telephone lines.
What do you mean by that?
Well, see, we not only had radio communication, but they had telephone communication too, all over the whole division. And wherever the division went, they'd plant telephone poles and string wire on them. And that meant climbing the poles to string the wire. So we lost a few wiremen that way. And then when they'd get to a place where they could do so, they'd set up a switchboard. And that would generally be in the basement of some place. And we had, once in a while, there'd be some shells would come in, and I think a few were killed at the switchboard centers and that sort of thing. But there again, I was so blessed I never had anything like that happen to me.
Did you stay in the field, in fields and tents most of the time as you were heading through France?
No, most of the time we'd stop in a village and commandeer a house.
Did you have to evict any civilians?
I don't really remember. Because generally before we got there, the advance party had already taken over the houses, so I don't really know where the owners were.
Was your area of headquarters typically a mile or two behind where the front line was?
Yeah, about that far.
So you could hear the bullets being shot?
We could. It may have been further than that. We could hear artillery fire. I don't remember hearing too much actual small arms fire.
Was there any time where the smell of death was pervasive?
I remember passing by somewhere in Alsace after a battle that had lasted about 3 days. And the tanks were quite vulnerable to the German 88 millimeter cannons. Our medium tanks, the real fighting tanks, had about 3 inches of armor in the front, and the front was slanted, so the 88s couldn't bother that much. But the sides of the tank were perfectly flat and only had 2 inches of armor on them, and the 88 would go through that armor and then explode inside the tank. And I've forgotten exactly how many. I think there are 18 tanks in a company and 3 companies to a battalion. And in that battle there was at least 1, perhaps 2 battalions in that 3-day battle, and we passed by after that was over, and it was just as far as you could see were disabled tanks. And there was a complete turnover of tanks and 3 complete turnovers of tanks and personnel during that one battle. I mean, dead.
Did you ever see any enemy tanks?
No, I didn't. I was far enough, I guess, back by being with headquarters, I didn't really get to see them.
Did you see any enemy aircraft that had been blown up on the ground?
No, I didn't.
Did you ever come across any enemy headquarters?
Don't remember doing that, no.
As you went into Alsace and later Germany, is there any one battle that you recall that sticks out of your mind as significant?
No, I don't really think so. I really don't think so. I got pneumonia.
Well, tell me about that.
And was sent back to the hospital in France. And I was in the hospital in France when the Battle of the Bulge came along. You're familiar with that. And our division was transferred to General Patton's army because he needed help. And nobody in our division had much use for General Patton. I know he was supposed to be a wonderful soldier and a wonderful leader, but what made everybody unhappy with General Patton, and maybe I shouldn't tell this story, but it's a true story, because of the fact that our tanks were so vulnerable to those 88s, somebody at the motor pool decided they could overcome that, and they did. They welded racks on the side and put sandbags down the sides of those tanks, and that stopped those 88s cold. They could not get through it. So the division was transferred to General Patton's army. And of course, anytime you're transferred, there has to be a big inspection, and the general has to come by and look over his troops and see what he thinks of them. So he came along and he saw the tanks with sandbags. What is this? Well, sir, these sandbags we put on there, that stops the 88s from going through. Well, get them GD things off of there. Those tanks were made to fight in, not to hide in. So he made them take all the sandbags off. So nobody had much use for General Patton after that. But like I said, I wasn't there. It was only hearsay. But
so what happened to you in the hospital?
Well, I spent quite a while. You know, I was back in the days before there was much going on as far as pneumonia was concerned. They gave me sulfur drugs. And I guess I stayed in the hospital a month or more. One poor fellow across the way from me, of course we were in just wards, there were no such thing as a private room back then. But poor fellow across from me had been there a month, and they were giving him penicillin. It was brand new then. And he was getting a shot every 4 hours, I think. And he had been doing that for a month. He looked like a pincushion. But he did live. So I guess it did him some good. But I stayed there in the hospital for at least a month. I don't remember exactly how long. And that wasn't a bad thing. You know, I gradually got better. And had an Englishman in bed next to me. And anytime we had corn to eat, he'd give me his corn. He says, "We don't eat corn in England." He says, maize. He called it maize. He said, "We don't eat maize in England. We fed that to the hogs and the cows." So I always got an extra portion of corn whenever we had corn on the menu.
When you got out of the hospital, it was sometime in January?
Probably was.
Did you go back to the 14th Army?
Yep, went back to my old outfit. And it wasn't very long after that, or maybe the war had already ended while I was in the hospital in Germany. I don't remember for sure.
The war ends about May.
Yeah. Guess it was probably after I got back we did a little more. But
Do you remember your commanding officer?
he was you mean the company commander?
Division
Commander.
Because you were with headquarters most of the time.
Yes. No, I don't. I don't remember. I don't know that I ever saw him.
Do you remember who you dealt with when you delivered messages?
I didn't really do much delivery. I just would hand it over to the crew chief, and he'd take it on to next in line. And I don't know if that fellow ever saw the general or not.
Who was your crew chief? The one you worked with most?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of his name. He was from Winchester, and we became great friends. I tried for a long time after I got home to contact him, and I never could find him. And I couldn't tell you his name right at this moment if I had to.
Who else on your crew that you generally worked with, do you remember?
Leroy DeRavel was on the crew with me, the one I mentioned earlier. And there was myself and Leroy, and another fellow, I can't remember his name either.
Is there any one particular message that you got that seemed significant or grand turning importance?
No, not really, because we didn't get too many messages. Particularly once we got into combat and were stationed at headquarters, the Germans were very, very good at triangulation. And you didn't have to transmit more than about two for those 5-letter code groups, and they had you fixed where you were. So we were mostly on radio silence. It would have to be pretty important if we did any transmitting. But we'd sit with the earphones on all day long. The three of us would be on 8-hour shifts, one behind the other. So we didn't actually do a lot of transmitting.
Did you receive any?
We received some. We received some messages from time to time, but not a great deal because the others had the same problem.
How far did these radios work from one another?
Not like they do today. At most 100 miles.
But typically your division wasn't more than 6-7 miles wide, is that true?
Maybe a little further, maybe a little more than that, but close enough that you could communicate.
Was there any time that your radios didn't work when they should have?
Not that I can remember. They were pretty good radios.
When did you personally enter Germany?
Yes, but I'm pretty sure the war was over because I remember crossing the Rhine in a parade status. The war hadn't been over very long, and they formed a company up in parade form and marched marched across the Rhine and into one of the cities and up and down to show the Germans how great we are, I guess.
And you were marching in formation.
Formation, yeah.
When you heard about victory in Europe, V-Day, what went through your mind?
I guess I was glad it was over.
Did you have any clue that maybe you'd be sent against the Japs?
Oh yes, that was the idea. The 14th Armored Division was to return to the States, to be refurbished and go to the Pacific. At that time, they had what they called a point system. Depending on your length of service, you had so many points. Your length of time in combat, you had so many points. And if you were married, you had so many points. And if you had a child, you were so many points. And I had enough points that I wasn't eligible to come back and go to the Pacific. And I transferred then to the 9th Infantry Division. The war was over by that time, over in Germany. And I transferred to the 9th Infantry Division, which was an occupation division. And I stayed there until it was time for me to come home.
And were you doing the same thing with the radio?
Doing the same thing. I was sent out to another battalion, an infantry battalion. Don't remember which one, but it was probably 100 miles from headquarters. Was at Ingolstadt. And we were probably 80, 90, 100 miles from there with this infantry battalion. It was a great deal. All we had to do, we had to check in with headquarters by radio at noon every day. The rest of the time we were free. We didn't have to do anything but maintain the radio, that was it. And that went on for 2 or 3 months, I guess, before the 9th that started to come home.
And where did you go home from?
Well, let's see. I believe it was Le Havre, because we came out through the English Channel.
Did you stop in England?
No.
So it was just France?
Just France.
And where did you come into?
Hampton Roads.
When you got off the boat in Hampton Roads, what were you told to do?
Well, we went to a barracks just as a holding thing for a few days or a week, I think. And then we were transferred back to where I was inducted, and I was discharged from there.
What did your parents think when you showed up at the door?
Well, of course, I had contacted them. They knew I was coming by that time. And they were pretty happy to see me, and so was Liz.
You
were married by then.
You had gotten married before you went overseas.
Yes, my first furlough was in January of 1944, and I came home and we were married on the 31st of January 1944. And she went back to Campbell with me. We stayed there. We had some good experiences there, some weird ones.
Was she on some type of housing program?
No. They didn't have that kind of thing for us back in those days. You did pretty much what you had to do on your own. The preacher who married us here had a friend who lived near Camp Campbell, and he found us our first place to stay. And like I say, if you want to hear some really weird experiences, we had a few. We didn't really have a honeymoon, that was it, when we went back, because we were married the 31st of January, and I guess we went back the next week to Campbell. We got on the train in D.C., and there was standing room only, that's all there was. And the both of us stood to Cincinnati. And then finally she got a seat in Cincinnati, and I stood the rest of the way to Nashville. And then we changed trains in Nashville and got into Camp Campbell.
Your experiences during the war, did they affect what you did afterwards?
Well, yes, I came back to be a bookbinder, but after about 10 years being back, I got interested in amateur radio and went to a class and learned what I needed to know to get my license. And then in a short while, I went to school again and learned enough to get an upgrade to my license, so that at that time licenses were in several different categories. Your starting license was called a novice, and you had to have a speed of 5 words per minute and pass a certain written test on regulations and plus some radio knowledge. Then the next drop was general, which required 13 words a minute and more technical knowledge. Then the next was advanced, and I took the test, went to school and studied, and I took the written test for advanced, and then I had to go downtown D.C. to take the code test and pass that, so I'm advanced.
And this was all sparked by your interest during the war.
Yes.
Is there anything else you'd like to add for our interview today?
No, I don't know of too much. You've got me pretty well figured.
How about your general attitude toward war in general?
Well, I sure don't like it, and I won't get into the politics of present wars and that sort of thing. But I suppose it's a necessary evil.
Well, thank you for your interview today.
You're
Mr.
certainly
Earl.
welcome.